Hi, welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all of the time. Puddles and I are here at Roosevelt University, the Chicago Performing Arts College, with Dean Henry Fogel, who is the Dean of the Performing Arts College here at Roosevelt University. Thank you so much for having us in your office.
It's a pleasure.
For those of you who don't know Mr. Fogel, he is the Dean here at the Chicago Performing Arts College at Roosevelt University. Prior to that, you were a leading administrator in the New York Philharmonic, the National Symphony, and of course the 18 years you spent as president of the Chicago Symphony. You also regale us weekly with your internationally syndicated radio show Collector's Corner. I happen to listen to that weekly. It's Tuesday nights, 8 o'clock, KWAX in Eugene.
Very nice.
Puddles and I were very interested in coming to speak with you because of your unique position, unique viewpoint as a leading arts administrator in the country, and as an audiophile. And you've had how many years? 15, 18 years on the radio?
Well, currently, I actually started on the radio.
No, I mean
in Syracuse, New York, for 15 years. Ran a commercial, because it's before there was public radio, a commercial classical music radio station from 1963 to 78, and I did all the programming. I would describe myself as a musicophile more than an audiophile.
Okay.
Because a lot of what I listen to are recordings made in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s of historic performances that wouldn't qualify as audiophile recordings.
Right.
But I have a collection of probably over 25,000 recordings at home. I'm the only person you'll ever talk to whose children grew up, moved out of the house, and my wife and I had to move to a bigger house because of the collection. Absolutely true.
You didn't downsize, you upsized.
We upsize, and I keep upsizing.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. Well, I'm wondering what in your capacity as a musicophile and then as an administrator before coming to the Chicago Symphony, what was your awareness of Bud Herseth and Arnold Jacobs? Well,
of course, it was through recordings. The Fritz Reiner recordings, but candidly, even before that, the Raphael Kubelik recordings, those wonderful Mercury classics. And I don't even know, you would probably know, I don't even know if Arnold Jacobs, I don't remember when he started with the Chicago Symphony.
44.
Okay, so then he was there, of course, during the Kubelik years, and even the Radzinski 1 year and so forth. But from the recordings, and talking to people, and certainly once I got into orchestra management, talking with conductors and others who had been to Chicago, you felt that Mr. Herseth and Mr. Jacobs were the foundation, in a way, of the orchestra, which is interesting because they're sort of opposite ends of the pitch scale, but that a lot of what was the brilliance of the Chicago Symphony was founded on Bud Herseth and Arnold Jacobs. When I got there and started to listen to them every week, the thing that interested me and struck me right away, hearing them week after week as opposed to on recordings, is that one hears talk of the brilliance of the Chicago Symphony and its brass. Actually, that's not what sticks out to me. What sticks out to me, what did then and still does, is the warmth, the richness, and the depth of sound of the Chicago Symphony brass. And the fact that when I think of Herseth, for example, I don't think of a virtuoso trumpet player. I think of a lyrical trumpet player. And of course, Herseth always said that his three models were all singers: John McCormick, Jussi Björling, and Frank Sinatra.
That's right.
And with Jacobs, who I had fewer years with, he retired earlier, emphysema really doing him in. The same thing, sure, both he and Herseth plays brilliantly, but it was the warmth of sound, it was that huge fundament at the bottom of the orchestra on which the orchestral sound was built that I think is what distinguished them. And when I think of the Chicago Symphony Brass, I don't think of its brilliance as much as I think of its richness and the incredible ensemble of the brass playing and of the whole orchestra playing, but particularly of the brass playing. I mean, not a question of just playing together, but a question of each player listening to every other player. And that's something that I know both Jacobs and Herseth worked on, talked to other musicians about, and in both of them in very quiet and gentle ways. If somebody wasn't phrasing exactly the same as everybody else, very quietly, without any fuss, so one of those two would talk to that player and get it fixed.
That's great. And do you, as a music file, I'm wondering if you noticed a difference in the quality of the brass section in particular, as compared to what was going on in the peer orchestras on the recording, say from the 50s, with Kubelik, with Reiner, Martinon. If you happen to notice a difference.
Yes, and I would call it that homogeneity of sound. That when I use the word ensemble, I don't just mean, as I said before, I don't just mean they played together, that the attacks and releases were unison. The sound had a blend, a homogeneity to it that extended well beyond those two players. I mean, you listen to the entrance of the trombones in the last movement of the Brahms First Symphony, and I've never heard a sound like that from trombones. It was soft, as it's supposed to be, incredibly rich, and it did not sound like different trombones. It sounded like one trombone who was able to play chords. And that is something that over and over again I heard with the orchestra on recordings, and again when I heard them in concert. Then, of course, you also the precision, the amazing accuracy. My first year on the job, actually my first summer on the job, I started in June, I think, or July of 1985. And in September, we did a Southern Illinois tour, and Hugh Wolf was the conductor, and John Browning was the piano soloist. And we took one program because we played in different Springfield and Quad Cities and so forth.
Right.
And in one concert, John Browning came out to listen. First half, he played Prokofiev Third Concerto, and then was Tchaikovsky Fourth. And we were sitting, he and I were sitting out in the house, and the brass just did this incredibly accurate thing in the first movement of Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony, with utter precision and utter richness of sound. John Browning grabbed a pen from his own pocket and took something from, I think, took the program from my hand and wrote on it a little note and handed it to me and said, "Enjoy your new toy, Henry." So it's that combination of precision and richness and unity of sound, unification of sound. I want to stress what I'm saying about this question of unity of sound, solidity of tone and sound of a brass section. I think at its peak, the brass of the Cleveland Orchestra under George Szell was absolutely as accurate and virtuosic as the Chicago Symphony Brass. I heard George Szell on tour. They came to Syracuse, and the concert ended with the second suite from Daftis and Chloe, and my jaw dropped at the pinpoint accuracy of that orchestra. And in general, actually, the Cleveland Orchestra, to me, which I think of as the other truly great orchestra in America. I think the two great orchestras in America are Cleveland and Chicago. And you think of Cleveland as with chamber music accuracy throughout the orchestra. But what they didn't have, for me, not then and not since, is this blend of sound. I keep using words like homogeneity and unity. Blend is maybe another word. Every instrument is at exactly the right, appropriate, dynamic sound quality to blend with every other instrument, so your ear cannot tell how many brass instruments there are in the chord. That is what I think is different about the Chicago Symphony Brass, and that is something that I know from talking with both of them is at the core of both Herseth and Jacobs' musical ethic.
That's great. Henry, I'm wondering if you would care to comment on that, just the nature of the orchestra hall, certainly prior to the renovation with which you were involved, in terms of the development of the so-called Chicago brass sound. I'm wondering if you have any explanation for that. What gave rise to that sound?
The hall probably had something to do with it because the brass tended to go over the head of the conductor on the podium, and so they might be asking for more when in fact more might not have been always needed. But I will tell you that I honestly believe it had as much or maybe more to do with the conductor, particularly George Schulte. Because when Barenboim would come in and guest conduct, first of all, one thing he would do is sit out in the hall a little bit, either if he was in the same week as another conductor's concert, or even have an assistant conductor conducting, he'd go out in the hall. And he made a mental adjustment for what was there. And secondly, Barenboim had a totally different concept of sound.
Yeah.
And yet I know Herseth and Jacobs never played under him as music director, but very often as guest. They adored Barenboim, even though Daniel spent a lot of time getting the brass sound down. And then letting it let loose, but at real climaxes. So I think the hall had something to do with it, but I think also the conductor had something to do with it. I think that was part of, if you listen to Schulte recordings with the Vienna Philharmonic, particularly in his younger days, they don't sound like recordings of the Vienna Philharmonic under, Karajan or other conductors. So I think some of it was the nature of Schulte and what he wanted. But I would agree the hall probably had something to do with it as well.
Yeah, it's always been a very interesting subject for me, and having played in Civic for 4 seasons, and having a chance to get up there at the podium area from time to time, just listen to what's going on in the back, it was always very curious. And with the Mercury recordings that you mentioned earlier, just the single mic, 20 feet over the podium, I believe.
Yep.
Just capturing the magic of that orchestra from that distance, just with a single microphone.
Yep.
It changed everything.
Oh yeah, I mean it changed for a long time people's perceptions of what was possible on recording.
Yeah. Mr. Jacobs retired in 1988, the 88, 89 season. I think it was 88.
88, 89 season.
And he would say, I can still play, I just am having trouble seeing, but he said that Schulte was very kind and really was trying to get him to stay another season. I think through the big anniversary season.
Well, because by that time Schulte had told us, we hadn't announced it publicly yet, but he had told us that the centennial season, 90-91, would be his last season, and he wanted Jake to play with him. And I was part of those conversations too, and in fact I did something for Jake that I probably wouldn't have done for any other musician except Herseth if he wanted it. We had a Japanese tour in '89, and it was actually split with Barenboim and Schulte. And Jake came to me and he said, I can't do it. I don't have the strength with the travel and with the repertoire on this tour, which if I remember had Mahler and Bruckner on me a lot. He said, I can't play every night.
Yeah.
I just can't do it. I don't have the strength. And I said to him, for you, because you've earned it with this orchestra, I will take a second tuba player. You play what you want, and we'll have, and it was, what's his name?
Rex.
Charlie Rex? No.
Rex Martin.
Rex
Charlie.
Martin.
Rex
Yeah,
Martin.
Charles Rex is an assistant concertmaster in New York. Rex Martin. It was Rex Martin, and we took him on that tour. But, so I was paying 2 tuba players for 1 tour. I would, as I say, for most players you wouldn't do that, but certain people made a certain contribution to the orchestra, and it's absolutely appropriate. But what that story does tell me is, it's interesting, and I can understand why he would say, well, it had to do with I couldn't see, but in fact, he was admitting he couldn't play. Look, the man was a brass player of a very heavy instrument that requires an incredible amount of air, and he had emphysema. It's not surprising that, it was a problem. It wasn't a lip problem. Lip was terrific, but it was a lung problem. So I think he could not, my guess, having seen the deterioration of the lung problem, is he couldn't have hung on another 2 years. But he is correct. Schulte did want him to stay. I wanted him to stay. But it was, I was very pleased actually to be able to make that gesture to him and say, one last tour, we want you on it.
That's great. Henry, during the 1986 year, the calendar year of 1986, I had the great privilege of working for the Chicago Symphony as an artist assistant, and that was a position that for which you gave the directive.
Yep.
Leslie Grimm and I were your 2 artist assistants, standing down there at the Red Post and helping the conductors and the guest artists that would come through. And I remember one time I was standing down there. The Berlin Phil was actually in town. And Karajan took sick, so James Levine was the last-minute guest conductor, and Emmanuel Axe was the soloist with the Berlin Phil. And that was very interesting enough, but standing downstairs in the basement, just overhearing these 2 great artists talking about Arnold Jacobs, my head just about flipped when I heard this conversation. And I had no idea. I mean, I am and was a brass tuba geek, fanatic, but I had no idea that Jake transcended that to.
Oh yeah, but I mean, I have to be honest with you, they were not the only international level conductors and soloists that would talk with awe about Jake and Herseth. But I mean, Jake, well, the current principal tuba, Gene Picorni, who I think is a great tuba player.
Oh, he's a fabulous artist.
I happen to think he's on the level of Jake. There's one person I can never get to agree to that, him. Gene will not accept that. And Gene, and you may not know this story, and people watching this may be interested, Gene Picorni, is a great tuba player, helped us. He cultivated a donor to endow the tuba chair. Mm-hmm. And the donor said, they want their own name on it, but they were a little uncomfortable with it. And Gene insisted that the tuba chair be named for Arnold Jacobs. Mm-hmm. And I said, Gene, I can make a case it should be named for you. And he looked at me and said, absolutely not. And he said, this is Jake. Part of it was the great musician that Jake was, but part of it too is he was a phenomenal teacher, apparently. I mean, I only know this secondhand.
Yes.
A, I came here late in his career, and B, I didn't ever study the tuba. But brass players talk all the time about what a teacher he was, and his influence on brass playing, probably more than Bud. Bud Herseth was not as significant a teacher. He didn't teach as much.
Not with words.
Well, no, exactly. But I mean, he didn't have as many students.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't formally teach. He taught by playing the way he played.
Exactly.
But Jake taught specifically, and I think if I had to describe the difference between the two, I think Jake may have had a greater understanding of the mechanics of what he did, whereas Bud did what he did almost by instinct. It's just like there are great opera singers who are not good voice teachers and others who are great voice teachers. And Bud could never really explain the miracle that was Bud. Whereas Jake, I think, had a more maybe analytical mind. But so he had a huge influence on that. And I heard other conductors all the time say, my God. Well, I mean, Barenboim used to talk about him all the time. He said that he regretted that Jake had to retire before he came as music director, because particularly, again now, in the end, we got Gene, and that was the same kind of level. But for Daniel particularly, orchestra sound starts at the bottom. And this is where he did differ from Schulte. You build, it's almost, maybe because he loves Bruckner so much and Bruckner was an organist, it's almost an organ outlook. You start with the double basses, the low brass, and then the cellos, and then you build the orchestra sound on top of that fundament. Barenboim used to talk to me about that all the time. And so that was part of his admiration for Jake. Jake also was, at least in, and again, I only knew him late, he's a wonderful man. I mean, warm, friendly.
A gentleman.
An absolute gentleman.
You know, there was I can't remember the year, if it was 84 or 85, but there was a Chicago Sunday paper that came out with a big spread on the front of, I think, the Parade magazine. It was honoring mentors. And it had Bud, it had Jake standing next to Dale with their hands on Dale's shoulders. Dale Clevenger. I'm wondering what you might have to say about Dale Clevenger.
Well, you know, I think when you talk about the Chicago Symphony brass sound and the incredible musicality of it, as opposed to just brilliance, which continues to be the impact that I think they had on brass playing in symphony orchestras, you can't leave Dale out. I mean, besides the fact that the horn's in the middle between the trumpet and the tuba, from a pitch standpoint, Dale, I don't know what he was like when he first came, but certainly by the time I got here and even started noticing him on recordings, Dale had some of the same values. Like Jacobs and like Herseth, Dale could play brilliantly. But what always impressed about Dale's playing was also the singing quality and the ability to bring that sound down and getting the horns along with the trumpets and trombones to blend. And I think he was an important part of that, although one generation younger.
Yeah.
And my guess is that both Bud and Jacobs had something to do with inculcating that ethic, that sonic concept into Dale. And it's, I think, one of the things that made the orchestra unique, as I've talked about before, is this utter homogeneity of the brass sound. And you can't obviously leave the horns out of that.
Right.
And Dale was a very important part of that, and in building a section around him, that was a very important part of that. And I've been a number of guest conductors, with Zubin Mehta, who had not been to Chicago until I came in '85. He just not guest conducted the orchestra. And because I knew him from my work at the New York Philharmonic, I asked Schulte, and Schulte said absolutely. So we brought him, and he came. Actually, his first concert, Zubin Mehta is the only example I can think of a world-famous conductor who made his debut with a major orchestra conducting 2 concertos.
Oh, wow.
He conducted a pension fund concert, a single night, of the 2 Brahms concertos with his good friend Daniel Barenboim back in '86.
Yeah.
But we then brought him back in '86-7 season, I think, maybe '87-8, and he did a Mahler 2. He did a Turangalila Symphony, Messiaen.
I remember Bruckner 4 with him also.
And then he did a Bruckner 4. And I remember him saying to me, I've never heard anything like it. Usually brass sections are either warm and beautiful or brilliant. This one is both. And I think that actually sums it up. It could be absolutely brilliant, and it could be absolutely beautiful and warm and even intimate. he said to me, Zubin said to me that particularly for Bruckner, he thought it was the ideal brass section because you needed both.
Right, right. That's a great observation. Thanks. Henry, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to share with us and give us your insight. This is a real treat.
Well, it's an honor to be able to talk about Arnold Jacobs, frankly, and Bud Herseth.
Yeah, the bookends.
Yeah.
Really, the bookends. It was an amazing time that they had together. And I think, just piggybacking on what you were saying, I think that when Bud came to the orchestra, Jake had a soulmate in terms of this vocal approach, and that I think in some ways it got Jake to really get more into his research as to, well, how does this work physiologically. You know, he did all these kinds of experiments in the University of Chicago Medical School back in the early '50s, and he always talked about Bud and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, again, thank you so much. And Puddles, he's always reminding me to make sure and be a good host. And so we'd like to present you with this genuine University of Oregon
Thank you.
duck mug.
Thank you. As somebody who drinks coffee every day, I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks so much, Henry.
A pleasure, really a pleasure.